this discussion, we'll begin to look at a very concrete example as to how IP was used from a historical context. So as the basis for this, we'll take a look at the Wright brothers and how it is that they got a patent and what they ended up doing with the patent afterwards. Now, I would indicate upfront that some of the facts and some of the positions that I will show you here may potentially conflict with your whole perception of aircraft and some of your perception of the Wright brothers. There's a great book actually that's entitled Unlocking the Sky, and that actually used to be a required reading in one of the IP survey courses that I taught in the past. And one of the great things about the book is that the majority of the book was all about how it is that the Wright brothers use their patents to control the market. And we'll discuss some of that today, but if you want a reference, it's a great book, and it's a fun, or at least I think, a fun read. So let's look first at the background behind what it is the Wright brothers actually did. So in the early 1900s, even prior to that time, there was this idea, mentality, that you had lighter than air designs and you have heavier than air designs. And the lighter than air design was kind of going back to Leonardo da Vinci, where if you had lots of feathers on you, maybe you would be able to survive. Now, the reality though is that if you attach the feathers to anything, more often than not, they cannot go up. Hence the reason why if you attach a lot of feathers on a person, they do not fly. And so that leads us to this concept of a heavier than air design, where you are heavier than air. How do you actually get it into the air? And the big issue that they would have was the weight of the weight to engine thrust ratio. So you have an engine, you attach it onto some aircraft, you set the propeller going, but the engine was just so heavy, and the amount of power you were getting out of it at the time was so little that the thrust by the engine was not sufficient to overcome the weight considerations that it was trying to drag up into the sky. And so in short, early 1900s, again prior to that time frame, this idea that there's a high likelihood you simply cannot fly. We cannot achieve lighter than air type designs. You could, from the point of view of like balloons, and even in France prior to the 1900s and the 1800s, the Gonfliers were these hot air balloons that the aristocrats in fact were experimenting with. But as far as being able to control how it is the flight occurs, in a balloon you're kind of at the dictates of the wind, and if you're in an actual plane you can potentially control that more, and that was really what they were trying to do. So Samuel Pierre Langley, this was on the East Coast, and received immense funding, pulling together from lots of different sources. And not only that, but he brought together under one umbrella the greatest minds at the time. And the question and the goal that he gave them was create a system, create a plane that is heavier than air, but is feasible and can actually occur. And so his teams got to work, and some indicate that it was a tragic conclusion of events, notwithstanding everything that his team did. And so they were one of the best well-funded ventures during the time. They literally didn't have any issues getting the best of everything. And they created a whole new engine that at the time was a 50 horsepower engine that if you look at the horsepower to the weight ratio, it was unheard of. That they were able to do like 10 times more power to weight type ratio than was ever able to be achieved prior to that time. And the final day came where they were going to be testing this out and showing the world how it is that they were actually doing it. And it was a little bit on a boomerang type mechanism where they would attach the plane. It was essentially on some type of a rubber band type system. At least that's my interpretation of it. They would pull the thing and it would kind of propel the plane in the air so that it gets a minimum amount of speed, which would allow it to then continue flying off. and they were testing this on a river. And so they had it on a barge, and it was a little bit of a windy day. So the barge was a little bit choppy and was going up, and they were thinking, well, maybe we shouldn't do it today. But the problem was they had invited all the press there. So they said, well, if we're going to do it, let's just go ahead and do it. And it was a terrific failure where the plane went up in the air and then went straight down into the water. And the conclusion from everyone and all the press that reported at the time was flying is not possible. So all the funds that they spent, the results of that actually were that it was not possible. And so you see here's one title, a news article from the time, Flying Machine Fiasco. Professor Langley's airship proves a complete failure. So which is kind of interesting. So it was against this backdrop that the Wright brothers come along. So it's the early 1900s, and they were located, in a different area in Dayton, Ohio, considerable distance from the East Coast, where a lot of the developments on flying aircraft actually were occurring. But in any case, they were interested in aerodynamics, and as you are probably well aware, they also had an expertise in fixing and repairing and building bicycles. And they would take their bicycles and they would test aerodynamics by just using cards and seeing how it is the wind flow would work with little wing devices attached to their bicycles to get a sense. And what's really is interesting about this whole process is that you compare and contrast Professor Langley's approach, which almost was funds without end. They had more funds that they needed, and they were just pouring it in on every type of scenario possible to pursue this, whereas the Wright brothers did not have funds. So they were riding their bikes, they were doing their aerodynamic testing, just using their bicycle, which I think is really kind of innovative of them. At the end of the day, 1903, they ended up creating a 12 horsepower. Now, keep that in mind. 12 horsepower versus how much horsepower the Langley's team did? 50. So it's literally almost a fifth of what it is that Langley's team had done. And yet, notwithstanding the fact that it was a lower power, it was also probably a lower weight, they were able to achieve flight. Now the flight here was not for an hour, it wasn't even for a minute. It was a mere, well we say, a mere 12 seconds. And yet the fact that they were able to sustain flight for 12 seconds proved that it was feasible. And that was the big point. That prior to this time frame, everyone had concluded and said it was not feasible. That you would go up and you'd go straight down. So the fact that they were able to have a sustained glide with an engine for 12 seconds shattered all the prior conclusions. So they had achieved flight. They in fact even had, they invited select individuals to view this test type flight. They had video that was there. And the results, again, they achieved flight. In 1906, they went ahead and filed for patent protection. So I want to stress just how much this overcame a lot of the mental blocks of the time, that they were able to achieve something that even the greatest minds with all the funding in the world could not achieve, a 12-second flight. Okay, so the question is, what did they actually invent? Now, one of the things I think is interesting is when we think of the flight, we think of often modern day type aircraft with wheels, and it takes off and then starts going up in the air. And that was not necessarily how the Wright brothers system or plane, in fact, even operated. Their plane was on a pair of skis, and sometimes you see that in photographs or artwork during the time frame where it's depicting the Wright aircraft flying over the sand dunes of Kitty Hawk. And you can see the skis underneath, and they chose that location because it would be easy on takeoff and it would be easy on coming down because they didn't have wheels. They were just using these skis. Not only that, they had a weighted almost pulley assembly where they would pull the system and it would drop down a bunch of weights, which would then push the aircraft forward very quickly. So Langley's system again was kind of on a boomerang The Wright brothers were using a similar type mechanism. It was a weight pulley system that then propelled the aircraft forward, which allowed it to kind of get a minimum amount of thrust to then be able to get up in the air. So the question is, what did they invent? Keep in mind this was 1906 time frame, and what they invented was actually almost, and from the patent attorney's point of view, looking at what it is they did, it was an almost genius type move. So you can criticize or dissect it one way or another, but the reality is that the patent attorney here took a look and said, okay, you have invented a new way of steering the device of the aircraft, and then he went out and looked and found that there was nothing else out on the market that had ever been patented relating to steering aircraft. So rather than specifically confine the steering type mechanism to what it is the Wright brothers were doing, the patent at the end of the day was all about being able to steer an aircraft, regardless of the technique used. With the Wright system, they were using a system called wing warping, and they were using that for stabilization. But keep in mind, the canvas that they were using was very flexible. So it wasn't a rigid type construction that we would think of an aircraft wing assembly today. It was so flexible that they could literally turn it one way or another. And you can see here on the right hand side of that diagram, you can see how this idea of warping the wing aircraft would then allow it to turn one direction or the other. So, and they would control it by foot mounted pedals that would then in turn pull strings to then warp the wings of the plane. And here's a quick little demo as to how it is that this invention actually operated.
One of the challenges that the Wright brothers had was to try and figure out how to make an airplane roll. There were a lot of people working on inventing the airplane at the same time that the Wright brothers were, and they were all trying to figure this problem out. Well, the older of the two brothers, Wilbur, had sold an inner tube at the bicycle shop, and he was playing with the box, and he was bending the box like this. And he thought to himself, gee, you know, if I can get a wing to change shape like this, I can get it to roll, because what's happening is on this end, when this side goes up, there's greater lift, so that side will go up, and this side will go down. And if I switch it, it'll go the other way. So I could get a plane to roll if I can change the shape of the wings. Now, he didn't go out and just invent the airplane. He had to do some experiments, and one of their first experiments was their kite. And Tom Crouch is going to discuss the kite with us today.
Thanks, Beth. Indeed, what we have right here is a full-scale model of the very first aircraft the Wright brothers built, and it was a kite. And as Beth explained, they began by figuring out how to control an airplane in the air in roll, pitch, and yaw. And the tough one was roll. And having come up with the notion of twisting the wings, changing the geometry of the wings, they wanted to test that idea. And they built this little kite. These things down here are the kite sticks. It has two lines, so you actually fly it by holding the sticks like this, and the kite's up there. If you oppose your thumbs like this, what happens is that you put a twist, a torsion, across the wing. And if you look at this wing, this is angled up more than that is, right? So which side's going to have the most lift, do you think? This side or that side? This side, absolutely. Because you've not only increased the angle, but the lift. And you can do just the same thing on the other side. And so this is how the Wright brothers, by maneuvering their kite, discovered how to control an airplane and roll.
All right, so let's take a look at what exactly was granted. Now that we have a little bit of a technical basis as to what it is that they invented, their patent that was granted in 1906 looked at in a flying machine, a normally flat aeroplane having lateral marginal portions, a wing, capable of movement to different positions above or below the normal plane of the body of the airplane, such movement being about an axis transverse to the line of flight. So you're controlling how it is the wing is operating. Bisaid lateral marginal portions may be moved to different angles relatively to the normal plane of the body. So these, what they call lateral marginal portions, may change the direction of the angle relative to the normal plane of the body of the airplane, such that it creates different, quote, angles of incidence. And then that causes moving these parts as well. So, and it talks about how the purpose of all this was to restore or maintain equilibrium or lateral balance of the apparatus and provide means for guiding the machine both vertically and horizontally, blah, 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 blah. So that was kind of what it is that they were getting at. You see here a picture of the airplane itself. And again, it kind of follows the similar type look as to what it is that you saw in the video. A similar type construction where the entire wing would be capable of being warped, which could then change that level and that angle of incidence, and they could turn. Now, keep in mind, 1903 was when they did this first test run, Kitty Hawk, and it kind of disproved all the conclusions prior to that time frame. But then what ended up occurring was that the Wright brothers went into this very secretive mode. In 1905, they offered their aircraft to even the U.S. War Department, and then even to the British military. But it was never ever really a full disclosure of the airplane. They wanted both departments to go ahead and sign these very complex NDAs that they wouldn't do it. They were ultra sensitive about any of this leaking out, so they kept it under wraps, and they kept it under wraps so much so that nobody was really interested in actually purchasing it. Keep in mind, 1906 is when they actually got their first patent, but even when they had their patent, that did not give them sufficient confidence to actually go out and just simply show their aircraft. They were very secretive about actually disclosing it, and as a result, companies at the end of the day and governments did not really open their wallets to actually buying it. Now, 1909, so this is 3 years after they actually had received that granted patent, is when they sold their patents to what was at the time the Wright Company. So, and then later on, 1909, they went ahead and actually sold that company as well. They retained some interest in what was sold, but then at the end of the day, the Wright brothers' ventures, as far as their technological advancements and their patenting process, kind of ended by 1910 timeframe. And curiously enough, 1910, we'll discuss Glenn Curtiss here in a few minutes, but they ended up changing the aircraft, the original aircraft of the Wright brothers, to mimic that which was at the time being created by Glenn Curtiss.